It's amazing how it's changed. Each subspecialty had its own journal. Like I'm a hematologist, and there was the journal of blood, and there was another journal on thrombosis, and the same held for all the other subspecialties. But the JCI had the reputation of being above all those, and was competitive at that time, I think, even with Science and Nature, which were considered the top general journals, and then Silk. So those three. And that's how we looked at it, that we were competing in these top journals. And there were just very fewer options for authors. A major difference is how we move these papers around. Now, when we were handling, 20 papers a week or so, there was no internet. There was very little copying capacity. So all the papers had to be mailed to us, hand typed in triplicate. We had to mail them out to the reviewers. They mailed them back to us. We contacted the authors. They submitted a revision and went through all that together. That was a tremendous amount of mailing. And it also, in retrospect, excluded us from using editors outside the US. So there were many papers where the good appropriate reviewer would have been in England or Germany or somewhere. We could not use them because the mailing would just take forever. And to give the post office some credit, we only lost a couple papers during this 5-year period. It's a thing that's pretty amazing, but that's what happened. But how you handle papers today is very, very different. And that's what strikes me the most as being different.
Stossel wanted to get some more objective understanding of the peer review process and set up several studies, one of which he published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Another, of more interest to me, was how the accept-decline calls by reviewers suggested by the submitting authors compared with those of reviewers chosen by the editors. The result, of course, would never be publishable, but there was a clear tendency for author-chosen reviewers to render negative calls.
Well, it was a very prestigious journal and well thought of. It was, of course, a much different era. Open access was just being contemplated. We didn't have today's myriad of journals. Nobody was thinking about AI, but the tectonic plates of publishing were starting to move, and we could feel them moving pretty quickly. We were about a decade into the new era of molecular genetics and medicine. Genentech and Chiron, the two barrier biotechs, had been founded, raised visibility, and the competition was becoming increasingly fierce and crowded for that new work. Cell Press had just been spun off. Science and Nature were going after that work. Nature Genetics, a journal I know you're familiar with, was sort of born during the time of our tenure. And Ushma, once I got over sort of the shock and awe of accepting the responsibility for this prestigious journal, I became concerned, as did the associate editors, that the JCI was at risk of falling behind, of becoming archival, publishing articles that were backward-looking rather than forward-looking in terms of where medicine was going. So in consultation with the council, we took some pretty decisive steps to reposition it. We made the journal more colorful. The journal we inherited had a gray cover. In fact, sometimes it was referred to as the gray journal, which was definitely not the cachet we were looking for. We made it more interesting, published more editorials. We called them perspectives on hot topics. We dramatically shortened the review time. recruited 6 consulting editors from around the country to sort of broaden our field of vision, if you will. And we started soliciting manuscripts, which was something that had never been done before. It was based on abstracts we thought were really good stuff, submitted to any meeting around the country, and we didn't promise acceptance. We promised a quick and clean editorial decision. And you know, it all worked. Within about 2 to 3 years, the number of submissions nearly doubled. And more importantly, we were starting to get the work that we wanted to get. Just to broaden the discussion a bit, the journal was also losing money. And the ASCI finances were shaky. We fixed that as well. We restored the journal to profitability. We put several $1 million in the bank for the society, which is sort of the basis of today's endowment, and decided to petition the IRS to designate the ASCI as a 501c3 organization, one that was tax exempt, able to take charitable donations. And there was an interesting lesson in that effort for me. You probably know that status requires some sort of public purpose. And our petition to the IRS was first rejected. And the thrust of the IRS argument was something along the following lines. Yes, you guys publish a journal, you have annual meetings, you elect people to membership, but we really don't see a significant public purpose. And interestingly, the winning counterargument, and the reason that we actually got the designation, was due to a high school science teacher scholarship program we had started a couple of years before. I was interested, as were several other members of the council, in early science education, and were concerned that science was taught more like history, a collection of facts to be memorized, rather than the fun thing it really is, hands-on experimental science. So we started a program that was funded by industry and grants, whereby leader teachers were given a scholarship of $6,000 to work for the summer in the laboratory of an ASCI member. And a result developed the competence and skills to bring that hands-on approach to the classroom.
So the old tradition is still alive. A few very good journals, mostly supported by nonprofit societies, with the intention of publishing any and all high-quality studies, regardless of so-called impact. Again, the emphasis on novelty and quality, not immediate significance. The idea was that you couldn't predict ahead of time what might turn out to be important later. And the goal was to publish papers as quickly as possible and not restrict acceptance to arbitrary reasons. And the profit motive is not a major part of the equation at that time, but now it's a completely different scene. The trends, unfortunately, are getting worse. The focus on citation rates and so-called impact factor. Distortion of peer review is currently common. Even some well-known journals effectively have a pay-to-play system. That's another story for another time. Returning to paper. Returning to the underlying question, when it started out, everything was in paper, and files were hand-carried across La Jolla by couriers in red bags. I sent you a picture of one of those. But then along came the fax machine, and this is a great luxury. And each of us had I gave each editor a fax machine, and they were thrilled to have it in their office. By the time we finished, the internet had become available. We were able to go online, making everything much more efficient, but we still met every week in person.
At that time, the JCI was the king, certainly in terms of clinical research, translational research. You know, I often tell people, if you look at Nature back then, they virtually never published something about a human being. It was all very basic. And science was pretty much the same way. There is very little. Now, of course, that's very different. In fact, if I may be mistaken, but it was during the time the journal started that Nature started Nature Medicine. And they were sort of a major challenge for the JCI during that period. There was like, oh, how are we going to keep the JCI being what we want it to be? Well, they will take off papers that we would like to publish. And I think that was one thing that happened that I remember very clearly, the concern about Nature Medicine at that time. And then, of course, other journals popped in too to get on the bandwagon of that, of doing things that had to do with translation. It was before Science Translational Medicine that came some years later. But you know, the way the Lancet has evolved is very different than the Lancet back then. There was just one Lancet. And so but the New England Journal, of course, was always always there. Of course, they'd been there forever. But I think it was really, JCI stood out really because it was the place you should publish. I remember as I had been at the NIH before I went to San Francisco and then San Diego, and I remember having my first paper in the JCI, and actually, I told my mother I had two papers in the JCI, and she said, "Well, when are you going to put something in the New England Journal?" Which was so I tried to explain to her it was better for what it was, but she's not in science, so she didn't really appreciate that. And I did have something in the New England Journal in a year or so, but that's beside the point. Anyway,
it was still scary. I'm sure it's much scarier now, but at the time we're going, oh no, there are these journals called Cell, Science, and Nature that were increasingly publishing works in the biomedical arena, that they also knew that there's a lot of interest in this particular area. And at the same time, Nature had launched already Nature Medicine and Nature Genetics. So we already thought, oh Lord, there's already almost too much competition. So we kind of thought about what are we going to have to do here that's actually within our control. So the first thing we thought about is, we'd like to increase the profile and visibility of the journal. And we were very fortunate that we were able to recruit Finton Steele, who was a PhD from the NIH, but he had actually been working as an editor at Nature Medicine. He had left Nature Medicine. We were able to recruit him. So he came on board, was going to take control of the front matter and try to make the journal look and appeal to as broad an audience as possible. At the same time, we also knew, if we want to start launching different types of attempts to increase the visibility of the journal, we have to be on a financially stable sort of surface. And we had promised that we were going to stabilize the editorial office of the journal, because the past had been every 5 years, the editor had to recreate an entire editorial office to handle the submissions, the reviews, the letters of acceptance, everything. And it was a huge distraction from really looking at the science. So we said, we're going to stabilize it. We had a number of missteps. Some of them were like the things you read about when they discover a postman not delivering their mail. We had a early manager of the editorial office. It didn't work out. They were finally terminated. And when we started going through the office, someone opened a closet door and found hundreds of manuscripts that had never even been entered into the system, that had been just shoved in there because the number of manuscripts coming in, everything was by mail. So this was like, oh dear, I hope we've been forgiven 27 years later. But we knew we had a lot of work to do, and we decided we're going to go make online submissions, online reviews. We're going to get rid of everything through the US mail. And luckily, Finton Steele knew of an individual that he says, I think can write the ship for you. And that was John Hawley. So then we brought in John Hawley, and it was probably more of an undertaking that he had considered, but slowly but surely, not only within 2 years, not only was the whole office running smoothly, but John convinced us, all of us, that in order to really remain fiscally sound, we're going to have to move to self-publication. So I actually have in my office a cover of the JCI, and people always come into my office and say, oh, is that something you published? I go, no. That was the first issue that we did self-publishing. So once we took care of those things, the only other thing we really could think about in terms of, I don't want to say warring, but competing with the other journals, is the idea of how would we like our own submissions to be handled? Not at JCI, but for any journal. At the end of the day, there was a consensus among all the editors going, look, I'd like to know that my paper was read, accepted, declined, asked for review by a world-class scientist. And I'd like to know they read it and that they made some sort of decision. I'd also like to know that unlike many journals, or unlike even NIH study sections, that they're not just going to collect scores from the 3 reviewers, add them up together and go, accepted, not accepted. We want to know that the editor is actually going to read the reviews, read the manuscript, and then come to an independent decision that the reviews are really just providing a recommendation. That's it. That the final decision rests with the board. And the next one is, well, wait a minute. If you have 14 associate editors, or however many there were, something like that, every one of them has different ideas in terms of rigor and novelty. And we decided it is not fair for editors to make decisions as an individual, that if they're going to reject, allow someone to resubmit with revisions, or accept, they are going to have to provide their rationale to the entire sitting board. And they're going to have to convince us that the paper is worth whatever their decision really is. At the end of the day, I always told people at the time, we had manuscripts published where the review said decline, they were just wrong. We had manuscripts where the reviewer said accept, and they completely missed the boat. And we also had papers where an editor made a recommendation and the rest of the board overturned that recommendation. So at the end of the day, we thought this is the most fair process. This is the only way that we can really, quote unquote, compete. We tried to make that known to the public, but with mixed results. But that's how we really ran the thing.
So I want to give a lot of credit to Steve Weiss and the editorial board from Michigan, who really set us up to take advantage of open access. And as you know, JCI was one of the first journals to really venture into open access and to champion that. And I think that was the biggest change that occurred around that time in scientific publishing, was obviously very important.
What I remember in 2007 was that open access was hotly debated. We were open access, but people had to pay to help support the journal. And that was a model that was, people were talking about all the time from the standpoint of making the JCI budget. Impact factor was a huge issue. And I've been out of biomedical publishing for a while, and I don't know whether people still fret over impact factor as much as they used to. Ushma's nodding her head as I'm saying this, so I guess that they do. But what I remember was that I always thought of us as trying to, not quite where Nature Medicine was, but that was our top tier competition, was Nature Medicine. All the other, we weren't going to get the kinds of papers that went into Science and Cell and Nature, nor should we. We were a different type of journal. And we were getting, I think, top tier papers. But I was never under the illusion that people, that we were always everyone's first choice journal, but we were many people's first choice journal. And I was always very proud of what we published, but impact factor was the key. There was a lot of discussion about raising impact factor by publishing fewer papers and more reviews. And that always engendered a lot of discussion among the editorial board is what's the purpose of the journal? Is it to have a high impact factor, or is it to publish as many good science papers as we can?
An interesting time. We started our tenure in 2012, and it was my opinion at the time that many editors of some journals, felt that it was their job to operate as gatekeepers, as if the science and the scientific process needed protection from bad actors. It was a time where issues of reproducibility had surfaced. There was also the rise of the sleuths scouring the literature for potential malfeasance. So it was an interesting time. But as editor, I had a different view. I set out a culture on the board where we'd publish science that was rigorous and advanced knowledge, but we aimed to limit excessive experimentation. I did not want the review process to be impeded and scientific process to be impeded, or to have discoveries left languish, unpublished for years. So as such, the editors really had to be highly engaged in the review process. They had to be engaged in the adjudication of manuscripts. And our goal was to get the best quality manuscript and science published and not delay or impede the process.
Like today, it's a field that's just remarkably changing. And in 2017, when we took over, I think the history of the ASCI journals is really reflective of what was going on in the publishing space. A year before we started, Howard Rockman, who was then the editor of the JCI, started JCI Insight. And he wound up, manning that with a team from Duke for about 3.5 years, well into our term, before he turned it over to Kathy Collins at the University of Michigan. So the biomedical landscape was continuing to evolve. There weren't as many so-called daughter journals as there are now, but they were increasing in number. Seemed like every week there was a new Nature or Science or Circulation or some other daughter journal that was popping up. And open access was becoming more and more of the way things were going in publishing.
I mean, the reality is that things were changing even before I assumed the editorship. You did mention the proliferation of journals. Not surprisingly, a lot of involvement. I don't mind the proliferation of academic society type journals, but the big issue was on the commercial side. The for-profit journals were proliferating all over the place and becoming super specialized, which made them more attractive to some extent for authors, despite the huge charges. And the other big issue you mentioned is the area of so-called clinical journals, right? And so traditionally, the JCI, from our name, obviously we are a journal, we're supposed to serve our constituency, which is researchers who do clinical research, and then also be able to appeal to people who do translational, so-called translational research. That's our core group. And that area was increasingly being taken over by other journals who do bits and pieces of it, not a complete picture like the JCI does it. And then to make things even more difficult for us, many of the clinical journals were more into clinical trials and reporting blockbuster type findings, which very catchy titles, epidemiology, data sciences, things like that. Not so much investigation, right? But that's what the public and some investigators wanted. So that was a challenge, trying to find our identity within this landscape. And then you throw in the issue with open access. As you well know, JCI was the first journal to start open access, but our definition kind of fell by the wayside. So we used the hybrid plan where people paid for front matter review articles and commentaries and things like that. But the research articles were free for the public. And unfortunately, the funding agencies changed their tune. So we had to pivot and figure out a way to sustain our efforts. And eventually, thankfully, we were able to go fully open, so-called gold open access, right? Which allowed us to publish everything for free.
Publishing is very dynamically changing day by day, if not moment by moment. Part of that's reflected in science is changing. I think we know science is much more international than it used to be. We have a lot more investment in science worldwide than what we had in the past. And in particular, many countries in Asia now are heavily funding science much more than they used to be. We've seen good investment in European science. We probably haven't seen quite as much investment in US science, but we started out ahead there, so that was good. But so it is definitely a much more international endeavor than what it was in the past. And so I think that gives us, we have to cover, again, a lot more ground. We're receiving more submissions and coming from all different places in the world. And sometimes covering more topics because of that. We get papers from Africa now that we didn't used to get before. And that's very interesting, very cool science to see coming along there. And so I think we have to cover a landscape that reflects science changing. And so what do you see on the publishing side? Well, obviously new journals every second. And it's very hard to, I think, for authors to figure out what's a reputable journal and what's perhaps a less reputable journal. And I think the strength of the editorial board tells authors that's what this journal is about. And journals in many ways are only as good as our reviewer pool is. And so we really, really do value our reviewer pool probably now more than ever. And that will continue to be that way because we're asking a lot of our reviewers right now. And so I think it's an important job for scientists up and coming to participate in the reviewing process, but it is definitely a challenging system right now.
Well, I think it served as, or it serves still, as an example of high quality, carefully done biomedical research, asking problems, studying problems related to human disease and physiology. That was how we felt about it back in 1981. I don't think that's really changed.
You know, I think the impact has been huge. The JCI from the start is sort of focused on translational science, work into space, ranging from discovery to early demonstration of benefit in humans. It's raised the visibility of that whole era. And of course, that plays to the strength of physician scientists, which is what the ASCI is all about.
Actually, the name JCI is misleading because the term clinical investigator sounds like we should be publishing clinical trials. But if you go back to the origins of the ASCI and JCI, what they meant by clinical investigator is something different. Medical doctors actually doing fundamental research. That's the idea. So we discussed the possibility of changing the name, but decided against it. So the name has been around for 100 years, and it describes what we do in broad terms. But the focus is more on basic and fundamental research, and some applied research, but not on clinical studies. The focus of JCI has been on being a bridge between basic science and medicine, presenting fundamental discoveries that are later translated to practice and then published in other venues.
Oh, I think it over the years has been just a really important journal. Certainly, my initial efforts scientifically had to do with metabolism, diabetes, and the development of the glucose clamp, which was still around today. And we were with the people that started that. And you know, they're classic papers that have been in the JCI for years. And I think that's exactly where people wanted to publish. But, you know, at that time, they were just sort of doing away with the going to Atlantic City and having the meeting there where there was this large cohort of people, primarily in internal medicine, some pediatricians, some neurologists, some surgeons, but mostly it was internal medicine. And the JCI was just the king of journals to put in important new papers that were making a difference for understanding human biology and physiology and pathophysiology. So I think it was a really important paper. And I think over the years that they've had a lot more competition, which I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that, as you said, pointed out earlier about the many Nature journals and the many science journals and eLife and all the other journals that are out there today.
I still think that at the end of the day, for anyone interested in biomedical research, whether they're a basic scientist, a physician scientist, whatever, I still think this is one of the go-to journals for this area, that if you really want something that's novel, balanced with rigor, true rigor, this is the place to go publish. We always used to talk about it. Of course, the JCI does not enjoy the impact factors that some of the for-profit journals have. But at the end of the day, if you look at 5-year impact factor, not 1-year impact factor, JCI is near the top. So we're not just looking, and I'm sure this has been carried forward, we're never looking for the molecule of the moment. You know, we're really looking for substantive works that we think are going to stand the test of time.
Well, I think what stands out with the JCI, as you know, is that it's a journal edited by scientists for scientists. And I think has a great brand name for, you know, many, many generations of scientists, not only physician scientists, but basic science as well. And I was thinking about it when you asked me to do this interview, that it's remarkable. One of the great strengths of JCI is that it changes editorial boards every 5 years. So you get a new look, a fresh look, but it doesn't really change the journal fundamentally. It has been for 100 years a leading biomedical research journal. And even though new ideas come in and new people come in, when you think about it, it's been very stable. It's had a great tradition to it, and I think that bodes well for the next 100 years. It does have a different mission, I think, than some of the other journals, and it's incredibly important to preserve that. I think that I would like to see the JCI take more of a stand on some important social and political issues going forward, if I had to urge for the future. But I do think the journal has a very important place in the overall scheme of things. And frankly, you know, it has been confusing, to say the least, to see all these new journals crop up. I think some of them probably play important roles and others maybe less so. But it'll be interesting to see how things sort themselves out. Obviously, with AI, the future is really going to be quite different than the past for biomedical research publications.
It would be naive of me to say that, you know, that without the JCI, great papers would not have been published, because great papers find good homes wherever. And there's so many journals that any one individual journal has a, you know, to be honest, you know, not a huge contribution to scientific publishing per se. I think the biggest impact of the JCI was to give authors a home where they could send papers that were being edited and reviewed by individuals who did the same job that they did. So with no disrespect to you, Ushma, as a professional publisher, people really did enjoy the fact that whoever were the editors or the editorial staff knew what their life was like, knew the struggles of trying to get papers published and the ups and downs. So I think people really liked a journal that they felt was truly edited by their peers. And I don't think there's that many at this level like that. So for me, that was the niche that we were serving.
I think the category of clinical medicine best exemplifies the JCI, in my opinion. And clinical medicine is a category where we publish human research. In some regard, I feel this is the most exciting. The most exciting papers we publish were in that category of clinical medicine. It's where we publish outcomes of an early phase clinical trial that was based on a basic science discovery, often previously or first reported in the JCI, and then the translation of that discovery into clinical practice. To me, that exemplified the JCI. And when we were able to publish these high quality papers of clinical outcome papers in early phase clinical trials, to me, that was so cool.
So I've always viewed the JCI as a forum for biomedical research with broad appeal and very clear links to clinical medicine and disease. Work that you know, would interest and should be read by not only content experts, but those in biomedical research that are not content experts, those who had expertise outside the field of interest of the specific paper. I think, you know, the journal itself is at the time, and I think still is, considered one of the top journals in the science and nature type of sphere, where top tier biomedical research is not only published, but hopefully it's a place where at times we can change the way we think about science. And even with the proliferation of journals, I still view the JCI this way. And I think features of the journal that have been, you know, important to me, and I think promote this diversity of interest to things like viewpoints and reviews, as well as the scientific papers. And yeah, we tried to expand that part of the publishing portfolio of JCI when we were editors as well.
Okay. So my answer here will obviously be colored or biased. And the reason is, I think when it comes to clinical investigation, I think the JCI is the gold standard. I can't think of any other journal that comes close. And the reason is as follows. One, we cover all specialties. We're not nitpicking and super specialized, right? Which is what many journals have become. So if you take the medical clinical landscape, we cover everything. Point number two, we are into clinical investigation. So it's not enough. Your classic JCI paper is not sufficient to just describe phenomena. That may be okay for some journals, but in our case, you have to address causal mechanisms, at least attempt to do that, be it using structural approaches or definitely function, and to a large extent, increasingly, some approaches that involve chemistry, right? So you put all three together and you literally, I tell my students, you literally have a thesis. You can't say that for most journals. Having said that, that becomes a challenge too, because you have to attract the right type of papers. The other big thing, as you know, Ushma, is we certainly use professional editors who clearly are very helpful running the journal day to day, but the fact that we use academic editors who are active scientists, in my opinion, is a plus, right? They're right in the middle of scientific advances. They know what is going on. And in our case, you're talking multiple specialties running the journal, right? So I can be in diabetes, but I certainly have a fair idea what's going on in neurology or infectious diseases because you sit around the table with colleagues who come from all kinds of backgrounds. So I would say these three areas are where the journal really excels, and I hope we can keep that going forward. I think one area that will always be there is how we continue to financially support the JCI. This is not a new problem, and you know the history of the society and the journal very well. So I went back and took a look, and as early as the 1920s and so on, they were struggling, right, with how to finance the JCI. So in the next 100 years, we need to be very nimble because we've moved away from subscriptions, right, as a main source. It's now open access. Authors are supposed to fund it. Is that sustainable? I don't know. Maybe some funders may decide they don't want to spend that much money, right? To continue giving it out to authors to pay for the JCI. So yeah, we need to be creative. Do we need some advertisement? Unfortunately, we don't sell any product, right? What we have, product is science. We are not like subspecialty journals like Diabetes or American Heart and so on that can afford to get that kind of support. But we may also have to look for philanthropy, right? Because I think the JCI serves a very important niche that needs to be sustained. So finances is one thing. The other thing that I think we need to look at is, I like the tradition of the JCI moving around one institution to another. It's historical and it's worked very well, but at some point, we'll have to ask ourselves whether it's viable, right? Especially if institutions may or may not be willing to step up and partially finance it, right? We may have to be more creative and come up with a system that involves more editors from multiple institutions and so on. We're going to miss out on the one-to-one, face-to-face meetings, but maybe that option needs to be looked at. And then the third thing that I want us to do is really appreciate the role of the JCI in the ASCI's reputation. I think sometimes we lose sight of that. And I say that because, let's face it, the ASCI is an honor society. Most people, with all due respect, don't even know about the ASCI. It's important to us who are members. But there are more people who know the JCI. And so we have to figure out a way to make the JCI be very prominent in the biomedical space beyond just the society, be very nimble going forward and realize that we occupy a specific niche. Like I said, we are multi-specialty, we are investigation-based, we are led by academic leaders and so on. So all those are pluses, but we have to be very nimble.
I think the JCI, through its editorial board, holds a very unique position in that it really is covering mechanisms of human disease. And I come at it from a geneticist perspective where we can learn so much about mechanism by understanding genetic mechanisms underlying a disease process. But that's a very interesting position to be trying to define genetic mechanisms of disease, and particularly doing it from the viewpoint of the American Society of Clinical Investigation, which is physician scientists. And so I think there isn't another journal run by so many physician scientists who, by nature of their training, bring a sort of different viewpoint to things. We obviously have lots of PhD members of our board and many PhD authors, and we value that as well. But I like what our editorial board can bring to looking at papers and how they think about things. So is this a cool mechanism? And does it really mean something for human disease? There are very few journals that can answer that question the way we do.